Welcome to Chapter 16, Part 2, on International Payment Methods. Have you ever heard of legless chickens? Well, other than this photo from CBS News, I've never heard of such a thing. So it's a bit surprising that a recent letter of credit referred to brooder stoves for chickens without legs. And it's even more surprising that the exporter was then forced to mention brooder stoves for chicken without legs on his invoice in order to make the documents match. So you might be saying, what is going on here? Well, let me read the whole story to you from the Shipping Solutions blog. Quote, "This post is about an exporter who manufactures items used by farmers, such as steel corral fences and swinging gates. He also manufactures brooder stoves. When a farmer buys baby chicks in early spring, it is cold outdoors. One-day-old chicks instinctively seek to gather under the mother hen's wings to keep warm. This mother hen is commonly referred to as a brooder hen. The brooder stove is a substitute for the brooder hen. By means of electricity or natural gas, it gives off heat, and chicks crowd under it for warmth. As the weather becomes warmer and the chicks grow bigger, the farmer raises the brooder stove off the floor by means of adjustable legs or with a rope hung from the rafters. This manufacturer received a letter of credit with the following merchandise description. Quote, brooder stoves for chickens without legs, end quote. Although the incorrect phrasing makes one smile, the bank will look for an invoice which accurately and correctly describes the merchandise as brooder stoves for chickens without legs. So a funny story, but I think it illustrates one of the challenges with letters of credit, which is one of the more commonly used methods for international payment. So we'll look at letters of credit. In addition to that, we'll look at some other forms of payment method, some challenges, and we'll look at the Export Working Capital Program. Now, the level of risk, according to the seller, varies, with the least risky solution being cash in advance and the most risky being open account. Cash in advance means that the buyer pays before the goods are shipped. Now, obviously, most buyers aren't going to go for this because it's extraordinarily high risk. What happens if the seller does not ship the goods? The cost is relatively low. It's just a wire transfer or Western Union money transfer. And it may be the appropriate way to go, as we mentioned in the last video, in situations where there's extreme political risk. A more common approach is what's referred to as a letter of credit. As we've said numerous times in international trade, the parties probably don't know each other. There are different laws, different customs, and various risks. So not surprisingly, the seller wants to make sure that he or she gets paid and doesn't necessarily want to rely on the buyer to do that. So what the letter of credit does is it substitutes the promise to pay for the creditworthiness of a bank. And it's the bank who promises to pay the seller as long as the documents are in order. So it's important to point out that a letter of credit follows the documents, not the goods. So a letter of credit can be advantageous to both the buyer and the seller in that it really removes most of the risk. And in fact, if the seller is not confident in a foreign bank, they can request what's called a confirmed letter of credit, where their domestic bank is then confirming payment. There are challenges, however, with a letter of credit, and one of the more obvious one is what we just mentioned. If there's a discrepancy in the document, the bank may not pay. So that's why in the previous example with the brooder stoves, they actually went to the trouble of making sure that the invoice had the funny terminology about the legless chickens because they had to make sure that the documents matched. If the documents don't match, as I said, the bank probably won't pay. And in that instance, they may have to reissue a whole new letter of credit, which is expensive. Another problem is if the date of shipment slips or if there's a partial shipment. And then last, not surprisingly, letters of credit are not cheap. So with that in mind, if the buyer and seller are more comfortable with each other, they may go towards documentary collections, which is payment against documents, also known as cash against documents. Now, obviously, the risk to the seller is a little bit higher than with a letter of credit. The risk to the buyer, however, is similar to a letter of credit, and in fact, it may be lower if inspection of the goods is allowed prior to payment. And last, of course, is open account, where the goods are shipped and then hopefully payment is received. The risk to the seller obviously is quite high in that they're relying on the financial capability of the buyer and the integrity of the buyer to pay. The risk to the buyer, on the other hand, is little to none. So one of the challenges of export, of course, is getting paid. Another is making sure that there's enough working capital on hand until the transaction is completed and payment is received. So with that in mind, the Small Business Administration and the Ex-Im Bank have working capital programs available. The Small Business Administration is for lower amounts, whereas Ex-Im Bank is for higher amounts. The SBA program has increased, and now they provide loan advances for up to $5 million to fund export transactions. I think your author cites a slightly lower amount. So it is an opportunity for reasonably small transactions. Ex-Im Bank doesn't, on the other hand, doesn't replace the exporter's bank. It works with lenders to provide a loan guarantee that backs the borrower's debt in the event that things don't work out as planned. And in fact, it provides a 90% loan backing guarantee. And there's no minimum or maximum transaction amount. So these are some opportunities that are available to the exporter.